Both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump are making a last-minute push for Latino voters. Recent polling shows that Harris leads Trump among Hispanic voters in the key battleground states, but is underperforming when compared to the last three Democratic nominees for the White House.
Harris recorded an interview with Telemundo's Julio Vaquerio that is set to air tonight. In a post on X, Harris shared how her agenda, she says, will create more opportunities for Latino men. She captioned that post, quote, "Donald Trump has disrespected and insulted Latino men and communities. As president, I will invest in them." Harris also writes that she will help, quote, "Latino men and others start and grow small businesses with no interest loans or deferred loan repayments and fully forgivable loans of up to $20,000, among other policies."
CNN panelists tried to explain why some Latino voters may be more inclined to vote for Trump. Let's watch.
And these polls are showing that Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, is underperforming with Latino voters. And I think, kind of what we've already talked about is Latino voters are not monolithic, right? And there are plenty of Latino voters who are concerned about the border, may want a stronger border, may look at, the rhetoric that Trump has about, immigrants or people coming over and say, that's not me. I did it the right way. They didn't do it the right way. And he has an economic message and a pro-business message and an anti-socialism message that can resonate with some Latinos.
MSNBC, however, refuses to admit that Trump has gained steam among Latinos. Let's watch.
This is a person that has been no friend of the Latino community, no friend of immigrant communities, and he attacks us constantly. So as a community, we should rally behind the person that has always supported us. Donald Trump has been the most anti-Latino president, the most anti-Latino political figure of the modern era.
Ironically, Democratic Representative Robert Garcia said all that while Trump was getting a standing ovation from the Latino Roundtable he hosted in Doral, Florida. Trump has said that employment, wages, and homeownership increased for Latinos during his term in office. Here's another look at the roundtable he hosted. Let's watch.
And I got a front row seat of how much you cared about the Latino community, and you delivered results, and you didn't pander to us. You gave us opportunity, and that's what we want. We want the American dream.
Yeah, it's just undeniable that Trump is doing better with certain minority communities, black voters, Latino voters, particularly male ones. Race is being depolarized in this country. We point this out all the time, that the Democratic Party's real having locked down the black vote and the minority vote in general is no longer true. Now that still Kamala Harris will likely win majorities of these voters, but just moving some of them back into the GOP column could make the difference in this election in the swing states.
Oh, it absolutely could. I mean, the number of Latino voters is increasing at an enormous rate. It's now double what it was in 2008, which is an election I can still remember vividly, and Latinos were a big part of that election. I do think that it is one of the honestly more interesting things about the way American politics is changing, how increasingly the schisms are along lines of education and income rather than race. Now, we can discuss a whole lot of reasons why that is so, and I do think that panelist who we showed there made a valid point about the fact that Latino communities are by no means monolithic, and that is true of different communities that are have heritage from different nations, be it Cuba or Mexico or Venezuela, different places. It is also true of people who are second or third generation immigrants as opposed to relatively recent immigrants. So there is a whole lot of change happening here. One caveat I would say, Robby, I don't think there's any doubt that the general trajectory is less democratic than it was. Sometimes with these polls, you look at the so-called crosstabs and the variations are vast because the sample sizes are so small. There's two polls within the past week, one saying Harris is getting 38% Latino support and one saying she's getting 58%.
Right.
So there's a lot to be skeptical about in specific polls, but yes, the trajectory is in the Republican direction.
I certainly expect her to do better than 38% with this category of voters. She gets 38% of these voters.
Right.
She's getting a 49 state blowout, which I don't think loss, which I don't think is going to happen. It goes to show that immigration is not necessarily the top issue of Latino voters, and there are Latino voters who are very much for reducing illegal immigration or immigration in general. I mean, sometimes they're interviewed right as they're for illegal immigrants as they're coming across the border, and they get interviewed. What do you think about illegal immigration? Like, no, shut this border down. Now that I'm through, shut this down. Democrats, I think, for a long time thought that demographics are destiny. The more people we bring in, the more heavily democratic the country is going to be. And I always point out, well, but many, especially coming from Latin America, many of these voters are more religious than more Catholic than the population of America. Some of them are fleeing dysfunctional socialist or quasi-socialist regimes, which they associate with an authoritarianism that may give them actually a distrust of the left. They're not woke. They don't want to be called Latinx. That was a made-up elite American thing. So, yeah, I think now the GOP has not, to my mind, actually expertly tried to capitalize on a natural suspicion of, I think, elite progressivism that many of in this community could have, because some of the GOP does. Some people in it do demonize or demagogue immigrants, and I think that was just short-sighted because these could be GOP voters.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that's a very valid point, that culturally and socially a lot of these groups actually have more in common with a Republican platform. And I think, I mean, I know I'm in the left seat here, but I think the Democratic Party has made a major mistake by assuming that the Latino political agenda begins and ends with immigration. And to your point, there was a poll done recently by the New York Times, of all people, saying or suggesting that more than 40% of Latinos in this country support the border wall and support the deportation of unauthorized migrants. Now, those are views that the Democratic Party would often try to cast as racist, and obviously that argument is not landing with those people. Now, I do still think that the Democratic Party also has an opportunity, if it were to reconnect more with its own working class, what was once its base, across all ethnicities on economic issues. And Harris, to be fair, is trying to do that to some extent with these proposals to make small loans more acceptable, to encourage people who are having difficulty accessing capital and things like of that nature. But it is a problem for the Democratic Party that these groups are moving in these directions. Yes, some groups are moving in the opposite direction, especially college-educated voters of all ethnicities, but it's a worrisome sign for Democrats.
I mean, and look at labor. Labor unions, the culturally becoming so much more closely linked to Trump and the Republican Party. Even though I think it's inarguable that policy-wise, the more pro-labor policies are on the Democratic side. I often disagree with many of these policies. I frankly don't want the Republican Party to adopt them, even if it would be wise politically or strategically to bring in more labor voters. But the fact is that they haven't had to really change their policies. Just the vibes, the culture of Trump is something that working class people appreciate, and they're moving in that direction without much of with certainly rhetorical differences from the GOP, but not a different agenda. It's still the Chamber of Commerce agenda.
Yeah, no, and in relation to the cultural issue, I mean, there is, for example, in Latino communities, in border states, there's quite a long tradition of Latino people working in law enforcement or having affinity or sympathy with law enforcement. And the perception, which I would argue is exaggerated, but the perception that Democrats are hostile to law enforcement has, I think, caused serious damage there. Then there's the religious issue, which you mentioned, and the fact that we alluded to Cuban Americans in South Florida in particular. I mean, that's a community that has its roots in fleeing Fidel Castro. So obviously anything that has a whiff of socialism about it is going to be anathema to those people for the most part.
Coming up next, we have Georgia on our mind. We'll tell you what we mean about that. Stay tuned for more Rising in just a minute.